Before we start, I'd encourage you to have a set of the sermon notes. If you don't already have them, just go to the link that's below the video. You'll be able to print a set of the sermon notes from that link. Also want to encourage you to have some communion elements. You want to have some bread or a cracker, you want to have some juice or some wine, and if you don't have juice or wine, probably anything to drink would work. But you want to have those communion elements because here in about 20 minutes, when we get to the end of this sermon, we'll move right into a time of communion with you. So if you need any of those things, I would encourage you to pause the video right now. Get whatever you need. Once everything is ready, then go ahead and resume the playback. So, all of us have had moments in our lives when we were absolutely right about something. And on the other hand, we have all had moments in our lives when we were absolutely wrong about something else. I've given both of these examples before, but way back in 1993, there was an occasion in which I went to a local Christian radio station. I was going to do an interview, and when I sat down to give the interview, they didn't have a tape recorder, they didn't have a reel-to-reel. Instead, they recorded the audio of this interview directly onto their computer there at the radio station. And this was brand new technology. As a 23-year-old, I didn't even know that that was possible, and I thought that I was pretty well up with technology. But this was the first time that I saw that you were able to record audio directly onto a computer. And the moment that I saw that, I realized that this changed everything. Because people would no longer need to have physical media to listen to their audio. They would no longer need vinyl albums. They'd no longer need cassettes. They'd no longer need 8-tracks. They would no longer need CDs because you could now put all of your audio onto your computer. Little did I know at the time that those computers would get smaller and smaller and smaller and turn eventually into iPods and eventually turn into iPhones, and now all of us carry our audio around on our phones with us. If I had known that at the time, I probably would have invested in Apple or in Spotify, but I didn't know, of course. So that was in a moment when I had an epiphany, and I was absolutely right that the future of listening to music and listening to anything and everything, that it was going to be digitized. It was going to be computerized. Now, that was 1993. Let's skip forward 10 years. Let's go to the year 2003. And for those of you who are watching this outside of the state of Nebraska, I realize you're not going to be able to relate to this a whole lot, but just hang in there with me for the next few minutes because the people who are watching this in Nebraska are going to feel very heavily what I'm about to talk about. So in 2003, the Nebraska football team had just fired their head coach, Frank Solich. And there was some hand-wringing going on about, well, who's going to replace Frank Solich? And there for a while, it seemed like we weren't going to be able to hire any good coach. And then, just as it seemed like we were running out of options, it was announced that we had just hired an NFL coach that had just taken his NFL team to the Super Bowl a year earlier. It was announced that we had just hired the coach, Bill Callahan. And there were some people at that particular moment that were, again, wringing their hands, but at this point they were wringing their hands because they weren't sure if an NFL coach was right for the Nebraska football team. And I told people, hey, don't worry. I may not be a Raiders fan, I may not be a Bill Callahan fan, but I can tell you this. Bill Callahan understands football. He just took his team to the Super Bowl a year ago, and when Bill Callahan goes to recruit new players for the Huskers, all he's going to have to do is just show them that Super Bowl ring on his finger, and the players are going to come running. Their parents are going to want them to go play for the University of Nebraska. It is not going to be long before the Nebraska football team is winning national championships just like they did back in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. And boy, was I wrong about that. Those of you who live in Nebraska that are watching this video, you know that those next several years were some dark years. And I'm not sure that the Nebraska football program has ever truly emerged from those dark years that all started way back in 2003 with the firing of Frank Solich. But that's another discussion for another time. We need to actually talk about the lectionary gospel reading today. All of that is simply to say that I've had moments in my life when I was absolutely right, and I've had moments in my life when I was absolutely dead wrong. And it just so happens that in the lectionary gospel reading we're about to take a look at, our friend Peter is going to have both of those moments in the same passage. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and take a look at Mark chapter 8, verses 27 through 38. Jesus and his disciples went on to the villages around Caesarea Philippi. On the way, Jesus asked them, "Who do people say I am?" The disciples replied, "Well, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others say you're one of the prophets." "But what about you?" Jesus asked. "Who do you say I am?" Peter answered, "You are the Messiah." And Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. Jesus then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. Jesus spoke plainly about this. And Peter took Jesus aside and began to rebuke Jesus. But when Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter. "Get behind me, Satan," Jesus said. "You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." Then Jesus called the crowd to him along with his disciples and said, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? If anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of them when he comes in his Father's glory with the holy angels." May God bless the reading of the powerful and the challenging word. So my guess is that this is a passage with which you are familiar. I am sure that you've heard a number of the things in this passage before. Nevertheless, what I want to do is what we always do. I want to talk through the passage, and I want to see if we can kind of track with what's happening and what Jesus communicates through the course of this passage. After that, what we'll do is we'll focus on 3 of the lessons that this passage has for us. But we're starting here in Mark chapter 8, and we have to remind ourselves that in Mark chapter 8, this is still early in Jesus' earthly ministry. At this point, people are still hearing about Jesus, they're still talking about Jesus, but a lot of people haven't made up their minds yet about who Jesus really was. And so Jesus decides to just ask the disciples, "Hey, what are you hearing about me?" And so the disciples say, "Well, we've heard that some people think you're John the Baptist." Well, that's impossible because John the Baptist had already been put to death. Some of them said, "Well, we've heard people saying that you're Elijah," which was really impossible because Elijah had been dead for almost a millennium at this point. And some of them say, "Well, others are saying that you are a prophet," which, isn't an unreasonable assumption for people to make, or an unreasonable guess for people to make. Certainly better than John the Baptist or Elijah, who were both dead. But then Jesus asks them, "Well, what about you? You've been with me for a while now, so who do you think that I am?" And of course, it was Peter who spoke up, because it was always Peter who spoke up. But the interesting thing is that normally when Jesus spoke up, or rather when Peter spoke up, he would stick his foot in his mouth. But on this one occasion, Peter got it right, and he got it as right as you could possibly get it. Peter was the one who spoke up and said, "You are the Messiah." And from some of the parallel accounts in some of the other Gospels that Jesus commended Peter for getting it right. But then, in this particular passage, it tells us that Jesus goes on to say, "That's right, but you guys need to kind of keep that to yourselves." And Jesus went on in verses 31 and 32 to explain everything to them. Jesus goes on to say that as the Messiah, that he actually was not going to be supported by the Hebrew religious leaders, quite the opposite, that he was going to be rejected by the Hebrew religious leaders, which would have probably come to a surprise to them 2,000 years ago, because they had been waiting for the Messiah for centuries and centuries. And they certainly would have expected that if anybody was going to be excited about and supportive of the Messiah, it would have been the Hebrew religious leaders. But Jesus is saying that's not going to happen. Not only that, but he tells them that he is actually going to die, and 3 days later that he is going to come back to life. And this was more than the disciples could understand or process or comprehend. And so it tells us that, again, out of all the disciples, of course, it was Peter who decides he's going to have a little talk with Jesus. And he says, "Hey, Jesus, come over here for a minute." And so it tells us that Peter tries to rebuke Jesus for saying these things. And Jesus isn't having it. And Jesus makes sure that the other disciples now hear what happens, and Jesus makes sure that the disciples hear him rebuke Peter in return and say, "Get behind me, Satan." Ouch. And says, "You don't have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." We'll come back and we'll talk more about that here in just a few minutes. And then it says that Jesus called not just the disciples, not just Peter, not just the additional 11, but calls the crowd, everyone who had been following Jesus to some extent, and says, "I want all of you to hear this now." It says, "Whoever wants to be my disciple, they have to deny themselves and take up their cross." Now, you and I have heard that term many times before. We need to take up our cross and we need to follow Jesus. But we have to remind ourselves that when Jesus said this to the disciples 2,000 years ago, they were hearing him say it for the first time. And this would have been a pretty stark thing for Jesus to say to them. Because 2,000 years ago, when someone took up their cross, that meant that they were going to die. And not only were they going to die, but they were going to die a painful, excruciating, and humiliating death. It was not going to be an easy death at all. It was going to be the worst death that anyone in human history had devised up to that point. And so, when Jesus says, anyone who wants to follow me needs to be ready to take up their cross, I'm sure that a lot of people went, whoa, I'm not sure I'm ready to do that. And Jesus goes on. He's not done. He says, whoever wants to save their life will lose it. Whoever loses their life for me, Jesus, and for the sake of the gospel will gain it. Now, we're going to talk more about that in a few minutes as well. Jesus says, what good is it for someone to gain the whole world and yet forfeit their soul? So Jesus has some pretty serious words for Peter, for the other 11, and for all of the followers, all of the disciples at that point. This was kind of a come to Jesus moment that Jesus had with everybody at that point in Mark chapter 8. And so what I want to do now is I want us to talk about 3 of the lessons this passage has for us. There's a lot more than 3 lessons in this passage. This passage is loaded, but let's focus on 3. And the first lesson is this: as disciples, we must try not to force Jesus into our own preconceived notion of who he is. I'll say that again because that was a mouthful. As disciples, we must not try to force Jesus into our own preconceived notion of who he is. And one of the things that made this difficult for Peter to hear 2,000 years ago was the fact that just moments earlier he had been absolutely right and he had been commended. Jesus said, "Who do you guys think that I am?" And Peter was the one who said, for the first time, "Well, you're the Messiah, right?" And Jesus said, "Yes, that is exactly right." And we have to remind ourselves that 2,000 years ago, The Hebrew people had very specific expectations for the Messiah. They thought that the Messiah was going to be a political leader, that the Messiah was going to come and was going to overthrow the Roman Empire and was going to reestablish the nation of Israel, that was going to restore the Hebrew people to their former position of glory. They thought that the Messiah was going to do all of these great things for them. And so when Jesus says, no, as the Messiah, I'm going to be opposed by the religious leaders and I'm actually going to end up dying. Well, that was more than Peter could handle or process. And so that is why Jesus didn't fit Peter's preconceived notion about who the Messiah was. And that would have been true probably for anybody. We're kind of picking on Peter here, but that would have probably been true for any Hebrew person 2,000 years ago. It just so happens that Peter was the one who actually made the mistake of saying it out loud. Now, we can look at that and we can say, oh, poor Peter. And of course, we know what was intended for the Messiah because we have seen the rest of the story. But we also have to remind ourselves that as wrong as Peter was in his preconceived notion, and as wrong as all of them were in their preconceived notion about who the Messiah was, that many of us have our own preconceived notion about Jesus as well. And that sometimes our preconceived notion is just as inaccurate, in different ways to be sure, but just as inaccurate. And I'll give you an example. I am sure that some of the people that are watching this video right now, that you are fairly conservative in your views of the world. And that's great. And I'm sure that there are some people who are watching this video right now who are fairly liberal or progressive, whichever term you prefer, in your views of the world. And that's great. And there are undoubtedly some people that are going to watch this video who are maybe more libertarian, and I could go through all of the different viewpoints that there are on the world. But you get my point. There are conservatives, there are progressives, there are libertarians, there are independents, and all of us have our views of the world. Now, what I'm getting at is this. If you are a conservative, my guess is that you think Jesus was pretty conservative as well. And if you are liberal, then my guess is you think Jesus was pretty liberal as well. If you are independent, if you are libertarian, my guess is that you think Jesus was pretty independent, that he was pretty libertarian. Because all of us, I think, have a tendency, whether we realize it or not, to put Jesus into our own little preconceived notion, into our own little box. And what's interesting is that when we actually read this book, and particularly when we read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, what we discover is that a lot of times Jesus doesn't match up with those preconceived notions, that he would be conservative, that he would be progressive, that he would be whatever. And I would challenge you, I would encourage you, if it's been a while, to go back and reread the Gospels and remind yourself who Jesus really was. I'll give you for example. For example, when I think of Jesus, my concept of Jesus is that he would never say something as harsh as, "Get behind me, Satan," when someone has an arguably understandable misconception about him. But this is who Jesus was. Whether I like it or not, whether you like it or not, this is who Jesus was. And there is a whole lot more of this that we find in here. And I would encourage you to check it out for yourself if it's been a while. You may find that Jesus is not quite the person you have made him out to be in your mind. That is the first lesson this passage has for us. The second lesson is this. As disciples, we must remember that our path was never meant to be easy. As disciples, we must remember that our path was never meant to be easy. In this passage, Jesus says, anyone who's going to be my disciple must be willing to take up their cross and follow me. And again, 2,000 years ago, those would have been pretty shocking words for Jesus' followers to hear. And I think that most of us have had the experience where there have been moments in our lives when we've said, it isn't always easy being a disciple. It isn't always easy being a Christ follower. It isn't always easy being a Christian. But Jesus never said that it was going to be easy. In fact, Jesus makes it abundantly clear in this passage that it's going to be incredibly difficult. And one of the things that we need to remind ourselves is that the word disciple comes from the word discipline. It is going to be a discipline for all of us to be disciples. It's going to be a discipline for all of us to follow Jesus in all areas of our lives. It wasn't meant to be easy, and it's good for us to be reminded of that from time to time. That is the second challenging lesson this passage has for us. The third lesson, and the most important lesson, is this. As disciples, we must sometimes choose between the earthly and the eternal. As disciples, we must sometimes choose between the earthly and the eternal. In this passage, Jesus says, whoever wants to save their life must lose it. Whoever loses their life will save it. Now, at first, that seems like a contradiction, but we have to remind ourselves which lives Jesus was talking about. Because Jesus was talking about our earthly life versus our eternal life. We have to remind ourselves what Jesus meant here is that whoever wants to save their earthly life will lose their eternal life. And whoever loses their earthly life will gain their eternal life. And Jesus goes on to put a little finer point on it by saying, what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? What good is it for someone to gain the whole world yet forfeit their soul? Because Jesus is talking about the earthly versus the eternal. And so one of the things that you and I need to do as followers of Jesus Christ is we need to ask ourselves on a daily basis, this decision that I'm about to make, this thing I'm about to do, or this thing that I'm about to not do, how does that impact eternity? Is this an important decision? Is this a decision that may have repercussions where eternity is concerned? Now, I know that you're probably thinking, well, Pastor Kerry, for you, Pastor Kerry, probably have decisions that you make all the time that have repercussions for eternity. And you're probably right about that. But what I would do is I would turn around and I would say the same is true for you, whether you realize it or not. There are decisions that you probably make on a daily basis that probably have repercussions for eternity. Where you chose to have lunch today, probably no repercussions for eternity. But the decisions that you make about how to treat other people, the decisions that you make about how to raise your children, your grandchildren, those decisions do have repercussions about eternity. The decisions that you make about who you're going to go and visit, the decisions that you make about the acts of kindness or the random acts of kindness that you perform, all of these have repercussions for eternity. And I am out of time and the video is going to cut me off. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to read the words of institution, and I would encourage you to go ahead and partake of your communion after the video cuts me off here in about 20 seconds. But I'd share with you these words of institution. From 1 Corinthians chapter 11, for I received from the Lord what I also passed on to you. The Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, this is my body which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me. In the same way after the supper he took the cup, saying, this cup is the new covenant in my blood.